So, why is Yemen a place that even a top United Nations official calls, quote, hell on earth? Think of this: a country of 30 million people, 81% of whom make less than $5.50 a day. A country where famine is a regular, ugly reality. A country facing right now what could be the worst famine in human history. A place where in 2021, 2.3 million children will face malnutrition, and 40% of households have poor to borderline access to food. A country in which 20.5 million people, that's 2/3 of the entire country, are without safe water, and almost as many are without adequate health care. Where even before COVID-19, cholera was rampant. And on top of that, there is the vicious war that has displaced millions of people from their homes, making every aspect of what I just recounted even worse. And it's a war that has been fueled by outside powers with all sorts of economic and geopolitical strategic interests, none of which matters to the average person who is being bombed while they are just trying to find enough food for the day. People whose lives are now even more at risk because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because poverty and everything that comes with poverty is the perfect breeding ground for a pandemic to explode and spread without any restraint. Yemen is a symbol to me. It's a symbol of the decades-long bankrupt bipartisan foreign policy of the United States. Because after all, both political parties, have been avid supporters and suppliers of billions of dollars in military hardware to Saudi Arabia, which has been bombing the crap out of Yemen, partly because of its shared hatred with the U.S. of Iran. Now, there might be a very tiny crack at this moment in time to at least halt temporarily the endless war. Joe Biden declared that the U.S. would no longer support the Saudis' offensive military actions in Yemen, including arms sales. Though it's pretty murky what would happen if the Saudis claimed new attacks were defensive in nature and what the U.S. would do then. I'm quite skeptical about the U.S. posture in that circumstance. And the Saudis are already armed to the teeth thanks to billions of dollars in advanced weapons sales from the United States. But Yemen is also a deeper symbol on a moral level, a wrenching example of depravity that we can't turn our heads from, or shouldn't turn our heads from, even as we do. How is it possible that we as human beings can stand by and let millions of other human beings starve to death, to let them live in the deepest of deepest poverty, to not have access to clean water, and to be the victims of aggression and violence by state actors who will pay no penalty for the massacring of thousands of human beings? So to explore what is happening in Yemen, let's hear from Scott Paul, who is a lead humanitarian policy expert with Oxfam America. Scott has a deep expertise in spearheading responses to global crises around the world, including in Somalia, Nigeria, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and of course, Yemen. So what really has been gripping me about Yemen, Scott, and this goes back actually before the current conflict, is you have a country that on a good day, and I say that somewhat sarcastically, is in desperate need of support and resources, and the people themselves are constantly in crisis. I read somewhere that 81% of the people make less than $5.50 a day. So in a normal circumstance, I assume that the challenge for most of the folks in the country, putting aside being bombed and the current war and the current conflict, which the U.S. has been supporting for a long time, has been supporting the Saudi alliance, separate from that, folks just struggle to make ends meet and feed their families. Is that a fair
Yeah,
representation?
absolutely. In fact, that's whenever I talk about and try to explain the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, the place I start is actually before 2014. because Yemen before this conflict was already one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of its wealth distribution, um, the most water poor country arguably in the world. Um, and it's over this inequality that all of these numerous other crises have been laid on. And so the war has basically just sort of inflamed and exacerbated that underlying condition.
And the underlying condition includes the fact that it has been swept by a cholera epidemic, right? Forget, we're going to get to COVID-19 in a second, but you already have a healthcare system under tremendous strain. I read again somewhere, correct me if I'm wrong about the
Yeah.
details. It's actually from your reporting and from your information. The entire country of 30 million people has 700 ICU beds and 500 ventilators for the entire country. So it's just astonishing to me to think about a country, as you pointed out, that's number one, water poor, resource poor, folks struggling to make a living on a daily basis, just feed their families. And then you put on top of that these epidemics that are sweeping the country. And it's just the crisis. I'm almost without words, which is rare for me, but it's hard to articulate to folks just how desperate folks are on a day-to-day basis.
Well, the epidemics are the war, right? And
Mm.
it's they're some of the many manifestations of the war. So you take those underlying conditions of inequality, and you imagine that public services are already inaccessible to a lot of people. And then on top of that, you layer on the direct conflicts, or I should say the indirect consequences of the fighting, which is to say, however many healthcare facilities there were before the war, there's now fewer than half that are fully functioning, thanks to bombing and shelling. And on top of that, you have healthcare workers who haven't been paid their salaries mostly for the past 4.5 years. That there's no way to maintain even a passable healthcare response in that kind of a setting, and that's the service part, right? Then you sort of look at how are the patients doing? Well, the patients are incredibly vulnerable to these outbreaks because they're malnourished. They're not getting the water and sanitation services that they need. So it's a confluence of factors. It's undergirded by this inequality, and then the rest is piled on by the conflict.
Mm. And I think we should be clear to my audience. I think when we hear the notion of hospital beds and healthcare system, I think our mind goes to what we're used to seeing in the United States. But in Yemen, it's very different. And it's certainly in poorer countries, it's very different. And probably even more so in Yemen, where you have millions of people displaced. They're not in their homes, they're in refugee camps or just scattered about because they're being forced to move because of the bombings and the war.
Yeah, that's right. And you figure about 1 out of every 10 Yemenis is currently displaced. And of those 1 out of every 10, a lot of them have actually been forced to move a number of times, either because their hometown was under shelling or bombardment, or because the economy just dried up where they were and they needed to go somewhere else where there was a promise of work. They're being persecuted, and people leave out of a sense of urgency. They don't leave just because, well, maybe in a complex crisis, there's something better just over the other side. It costs a lot to leave in a context like this, and so where they go, it's bound to be overwhelmed and difficult to provide service.
Mhm. Okay, so COVID-19, how has that made things worse? And I assume that Yemen is just not able to cope with the pandemic as it enters the country. I assume vaccines are hard to come by, medical care. Tell us a little bit how
Yeah.
COVID has infected and affected the folks there.
Well, I should say, it's really hard to put numbers on this.
Mm.
Testing is inadequate, to say the least. People only really get tested for COVID when they're about to die in Yemen. So it's that sort of speaks to the level of stress on the healthcare system as a whole and the stress that families are facing. Because there's a stigma around COVID-19, but also there's a cost to seeking treatment for COVID-19. When families are as poor as they are in Yemen, they're unable to pull together the money to pay for a meal. They have to actually think about it and consider, well, am I going to use what little I have left in the credit in my community, or can I borrow from local families? Can I borrow from friends and families um, to try to treat someone with COVID? And if I do, am I going to give up the opportunity to earn a day's living that can support the rest of my family for a day? So every one of Yemeni families are just going through these heartbreaking choices every single day. And you can bet that when someone decides to finally get treated and get tested, it's because things are already pretty far gone. Um, and that's why, you know, if you just look at pure statistics, Yemen has by far the highest mortality rate from COVID-19 in the world. I think the current figure is around 22%, about four times the rate of any of the next highest country. But we have to imagine, we believe that there are a lot more people suffering from COVID-19 in their own homes, out of sight from the international community, and even out of sight from their own neighbors, because they're facing so many crises that it's not the most urgent until they're about to die.
Mm. And I would assume, and this is sort of a parallel in the United States, if you look at the communities that have been hit hardest in the United States, it's people of color and poorer communities, because there is no concept of social distancing. You can't just simply go and find a hotel room and kind of weather the storm of the pandemic. You're forced, because of your economic reality, to live with 8, 10, 12 people in a very small area. And as you and I know, and as everybody knows, the closer you are to people, the more likely it is you will get sick. And that must be even 1,000-fold in Yemen, where there is no sense of social distancing, partly because if there are millions of people who are, as you said, 1 out of 10, I believe, who are displaced, where would they go?
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you're living in a settlement for displaced people, you don't get to set the limits of your distance, right? It's done for you because it's the best it's the best chance you have at survival. For people who are living in camps, it is very, very difficult to prevent the spread. And for people who aren't, you're still looking at a population of about 30 million people, and out of that, about 26 million people need some form of aid to live a dignified life. And out of that, about 16 million by June will be so hungry, so food insecure, that they're vulnerable to the most basic preventable diseases like cholera and acute watery diarrhea, diphtheria, dengue. So it stands to reason that not only are they physically vulnerable, but they're socially vulnerable in just the way you're describing.
You mentioned, and I let it pass, but I didn't forget, you mentioned that there's a stigma associated with COVID-19 in the community. Explain that.
Well, it's an unknown, and much in the same way as we see in the United States, there's a stigma. There's a stigma around changing your life for something unknown. I don't know exactly how Yemenis would describe it, but I can tell you, for example, in northern Yemen, where most Yemenis live, the authorities in Sana'a have basically said they won't report or publicize infections anymore. There are no COVID statistics in most of the populated parts of Yemen, and the rationale for that is, well, we don't want to cause a panic. I think that that's a very problematic approach to managing a public health crisis, but it speaks to and compounds the fears that Yemenis have of a disease that they don't really understand.
Mm-hmm. Now, I noted that obviously from what you described, there's a huge level of need and a huge need for aid. And explain to me why Yemen's aid response is more than 50% underfunded. There was a donor pledging conference by the UN, and you're very, very familiar with this, where there was an ask of 3.85 billion, but less than half of that was received. Why is that in a country of such need?
You'd have to ask the donors. It's a really disappointing showing on the part of the international community. So much so We hope there's going to be follow-up efforts throughout the year to continue to raise concerns and sound the alarm. I should say at the outset when we talk about aid is not going to solve the problem. In fact, aid is not really, even if it's, if $3.8 billion is actually contributed, it's not going to meet the need. It is going to help save lives of the most vulnerable people that we can reach, and that is going to make a difference for millions and millions of Yemenis. But there's really only one way to sort of really resolve the issues underlying people suffering, and that is a political solution to the conflict. But failing that, there really is no excuse, in my opinion.
And that's a great transition to the other piece that we wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the political situation. I wanted to first talk about the people before we talked about the politics, so that people got a sense of the humanitarian crisis. But the political reality is this. The United States has supported the Saudi regime, which has been bombing Yemen relentlessly for a very long time. And this is unfortunately a bipartisan reality. You could say that the Trump administration certainly agreed to give a whole new suite of weapons to the Saudis, but this goes back to Democratic administrations as well. There is this alliance with Saudi Arabia that is at the heart, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, of this conflict. Or to say it another way, if Saudi Arabia pulled back and agreed to a settlement, the war would pretty much be over.
Well, I don't think that's true anymore. That last part, and it's arguable whether that's ever true. But what's happened is that the conflict has fragmented so much since 2015 that there are actually many different conflicts taking place in Yemen. But the underlying dynamics, I think, are telling. In 2015, the conflict had already been going on, but in 2015, when President Obama's administration decided to support the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition in its intervention in Yemen, there wasn't a whole lot of thought about a Yemen strategy. There was a thought about a Gulf strategy, and there was a thought about a regional strategy. This was what they needed to do in order to strengthen their case for diplomacy with Iran, in order to strengthen alliances with the Saudis and Emiratis and other Gulf partners. And what happened in Yemen was sort of an afterthought. Like you said, the Trump administration took that a step further and basically said, "Well, it's the alliances that are the policy." I'm hopeful that we've now turned a page with that in the Biden administration. President Biden, in one of the first announcements of his presidency, said, "We're not going to be supporting offensive operations anymore. We're not going to be selling related arms." And importantly, he appointed Tim Lenderking, who is a career diplomat in the State Department, to be his special envoy for Yemen. He has a really tough job, but I think my hope is, wherever there are differences between a humanitarian organization and the Biden administration, my hope is that we can have the conversation with the Biden administration about what's good for Yemen, as opposed to trying to push a Yemen-centered agenda against a Saudi-centered agenda or an Emirati-centered agenda or an Iran-centered agenda. So my hope is that that's a change, a really important change.
Or a U.S.-centered agenda probably is what you were thinking about, in the sense of, and just let's wind back for a second, the way it was viewed was, in fact, how to deal with Iran, and this is why Saudi Arabia is obviously involved. And then the question really becomes, don't you have to actually have a rethinking of really the remnants or the existence of the war on terror, because that's at the central part of it. This whole dynamic that has existed for 20 years in the way the U.S. has viewed the world and how it divides up the world. Actually, it goes back before 9/11, but certainly the money, the alliances, the way the war on terror was prosecuted, first against Iraq and then Iran being seen as the enemy. The litany. You really have to have a complete rethink of the U.S.'s place in the globe, because you can't actually just excise that, right?
I think that's right. But I think that the piecemeal steps that have been taken so far with respect to Yemen are mostly the right ones. There is a very concerted effort for on the part of the Biden administration to have a Yemen policy. Whether they're hitting the right notes is going to be a conversation we have with them, hopefully in a constructive way for a long time. And it's going to be really difficult because, not only are the Saudis playing a problematic role, and the Emiratis in their way, but also the Houthis and also the Iranians and also a number of different armed groups on the ground, the internationally recognized government. And so this now becomes for the Biden administration a a sort of a challenge of fine tuning diplomacy as opposed to stopping fueling the conflict.
Could there be a way, and as we wrap up our conversation, could there be a way that these parties could agree, and I know this is perhaps being a little bit Pollyannish, to hold off on the political solution, understand there's tremendous amount of differences, conflicts, all sorts of political interest, but agree to at least allow the humanitarian crisis to be dealt with, whether that be a ceasefire to allow people to either resettle themselves or to get simply medical aid to deal with the pandemic itself?
So that is, I think, exactly what Special Envoy Lenderking and UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths have been pushing. It's a ceasefire to start, but it's not just a ceasefire because, even if you don't reassemble a constitutional process for Yemen, the problem is the thing that the principal parties are fighting over is government revenues, in a way, if you want to put it that way. They're fighting over natural resources. They're fighting over customs income. They're fighting over the use of the ports and the airports. And so it's going to take a much more ambitious effort to get peace in Yemen. But even the more elusive short-term focus is going to be hard to get, but is incredibly important. If they can manage to get those dynamics hammered out, they will be doing, I think, most Yemenis a tremendous service.
Well, if you're a rational actor in this situation, you could be talked to, and it could be pretty obvious that if at the end of the day you end up being victorious, or you have your slice of the political pie or the resource pie, you certainly want to do that and be handed a country where you don't have a huge number of people dying from COVID and being sick, because that'll just set back any efforts that you have in terms of rebuilding the country.
I completely agree with you, Jonathan. And I think one of our roles, as Oxfam, as members of a humanitarian community that's tried to support Yemeni civil society, to also raise this message. We've been trying to emphasize the consequences of the conflict, to make it clear to the parties that the win at all costs strategy is ultimately going to backfire for everybody. Arguably, it already has.
Well, Scott, thank you again for your work and for Oxfam's work. And we certainly will keep track of this story and have you back on the program again to update us, hopefully in an optimistic way. Thanks again for being with us.
That'd be my pleasure. Thanks, Jonathan.